Hello, everybody. My name is Sara van Velkinburgh, and I am obviously a senior here. And my keystone project is titled Giving Up the Ghost, When Does a Dictator Step Down? So before I launch into exactly my findings, I want to provide you all with a bit of context. And that would be last year, from about April until August, thousands of Venezuelans took to the street on a daily basis to protest the regime of Nicolas Maduro. In total, there were over 9,000 protests last year alone. According to the most recent Quality of Life survey, 6 in 10 Venezuelans have lost an average of 20 pounds in the course of the last year. And Venezuela's annual inflation rate, so not its total inflation, but its annual rate of inflation, is at about 8,000%. Despite this widespread crisis, the government has refused to allow in any form of international aid. My keystone seeks to understand how, despite this political, economic, and social crisis, the government has stayed in power and maintained control. I found that a lot of the regime's ability to stay in power stems essentially from Nicolas Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez entered the political scene in 1992 amid widespread distrust for the existing political systems and political parties. He launched a coup, and he failed, but his televised arrests gained him a widespread following and made him a household name. So in 1999, when he ran for the presidency, he won, and he acted much needed social changes. One of the things that he did was started something called misiones, and he cut extreme poverty by half. He also, however, enacted a constitutional reform, which provided one of the most presidential constitutions in all of Latin America. He essentially consolidated power within his party and expanded his control to the Supreme Court, the Electoral Commission, and the military. When he died in office in 2013, his vice president, Nicolas Maduro, came to power. Now, the crisis began actually under Hugo Chavez. In 2012, Venezuela began its tailspin, which has been described by the Brookings Institution as RIDS, recession, inflation, deficits, debt, and shortages. Because of the existing institutions and how they favored the ruling party, when protests broke out in 2014, Nicolas Maduro was very well equipped to crack down on those protests. Ironically, they were protesting insecurity and inflation. At that point, inflation was at 56.2%. In 2015, when the opposition finally gained control of the Asamblea Nacional, the National Assembly, the unicameral legislature, the Supreme Court, dominated by Maduro and Chavez's supporters, ruled that there was electoral 5 in 5 of the states, stripping the opposition of their majority. 2017, 2 years later, after failing to come to an agreement, Nicolas Maduro decided that they would actually enact a constitutional reform and annulled entirely La Asamblea Nacional. So by all standards, we've reached a situation in which Venezuela has a competitive authoritarian regime. This essentially refers to regimes that are civilian regimes in which formal democratic institutions exist and are widely viewed as the main means to gain power, but in which the incumbent's abuse of the state places them at a significant advantage. Essentially, there is competition, but it's very unfair. And under Nicolas Maduro, we've seen it become more and more authoritarian. This is important, and it's important to identify the regime correctly, because by saying that it's not an authoritarian regime, we fail to correctly identify the problem and fail to identify the correct solution. Venezuela doesn't need to strengthen its democratic institutions. What it needs is a democratic transition entirely. So this all explains how Nicolas Maduro has consolidated power and how he stays in power, but it doesn't explain why the international community has failed to do anything about it. And what I found is a lot of this has to do with support a lot of the international support can be traced to anti-imperialist sentiment and dependence on Venezuelan oil imports. Venezuela's largest financier is China. China has provided roughly $55 billion to the regime. $17 billion remain outstanding. It has done so primarily through state-owned enterprises and development bank loans. Venezuela's second most important financier is Russia, and Russia has provided $17 billion, with roughly $8 billion of those dollars remaining outstanding. It has also done this through state-owned enterprises. The interesting thing here is that in exchange for 49.9% of Citgo, Rosneft, the state-owned enterprise, provided $1.5 billion of debt. That is to say, a Russian state-owned enterprise owns 49.9% of Citgo. And when I say Citgo, I'm referring to the sign that is about 100 yards away from us today. This explains why the international bodies, such as the United Nations, have failed to act. But this still doesn't tell us the whole story. It doesn't explain why regional allies have failed to condemn the regime. Again, this goes back to anti-imperialist sentiment and oil. In 2005, under Hugo Chavez, Venezuela launched an initiative known as Petrocaribe, which provides low-cost oil to Caribbean nations as part of a long-term loan that can be repaid in goods or services. On average, Caribbean nations spend about 13% of their GDP on oil imports. So this program is very significant to their overall economic well-being. And this explains that why in July of last year, when the Organization of American States tried to enact the democratic charter against Venezuela, they were unable to gain the sufficient number of votes, because essentially too many nations depend on Venezuela for their oil. Now, Venezuela's closest ally is undoubtedly Cuba. This began way before in the 1990s through a close personal friendship between Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez. That is Fidel, that is Hugo Chavez. This has continued under Maduro, and yes, there was a transition of power in Cuba last week, but I don't expect the situation to change much. Throughout the years, Venezuela has provided Cuba with the same subsidized oil loans, and Cuba has chosen to repay those in healthcare workers, military advisors, and political advisors. And while there are actually less Cubans in Venezuela right now because of the crisis, Cuba has become more important to Venezuela's intelligence operations. It currently runs 2 intelligence centers within the presidential palace, and these centers are astronomically important to helping Nicolas Maduro make any form of decision. So my next question was, where do we go from here, and what can be done? I essentially proposed a 2-pronged strategy. The first being weaken the regime's international support, and the second being provide the regime with a clear off-ramp. So first and foremost, we need to coordinate and synchronize international sanctions. Currently, the European Union and the United States have sanctioned 55 Venezuelan officials. Panama and the United States have sanctioned 55 individuals. The EU and Switzerland have sanctioned 7. The EU and Switzerland should obviously broaden to include that full list of 55 officials. This would send a much more clear message and would also basically decredit some of Nicolas Maduro's claims that this is a imperialist-imposed crisis. This should go hand in hand with rewriting the existing sanctions, though. Sanctions placed on Venezuela's financial sector by the United States has prevented Venezuela from restructuring their debt, but it hasn't provided any conditions under which these sanctions could be removed and new debt could be issued. The United States should rewrite these sanctions so that it provides the regime with a clear off-ramp and essentially gives conditions in which this debt could be issued, perhaps linking it to approval by the National Assembly, which currently has been ruled defunct by Nicolas Maduro. Secondly, I think it's incredibly important that we gain tacit approval for a transition from the regime's allies. Do I think that Russia or China are going to outwardly support a democratic transition? No. Do I think we could get tacit approval? Yes. That's because their bottom line is to secure the commodity in a future, and frankly, Venezuela has failed to provide oil in a timely manner, and Venezuela's oil industry is collapsing from a lack of investment. This goes hand in hand, again, with seeking to engage the regime in a dialogue. And I say this is important because by isolating the regime diplomatically, we are only encouraging it to entrench. If you look around the region, there are several heads of state in prison or currently being prosecuted for crimes committed during their regime. Nicolas Maduro has very little incentive to leave office if that is the only outcome. Therefore, the regime's allies and those who have recently become allies of a coalition to remove Nicolas Maduro should engage the regime in a dialogue so that we might actually come to a solution. All right. Thank you so much.